So it's 5 past, and the title of the session, as you already know, is Key Aspects for FAIR for Infrastructure Solutions, and the subtext here is for biomolecular life sciences. So, I mean, there's a lot of discussions on FAIR in general, and then we would like to have some discussions with our own lingo and their own frame of context to make sure that we're starting from a good place, and then maybe we can connect to some of the activities in the broader RDA community as well. This session is organized by the Life Sciences Data Infrastructures Interest Group. And for those who are new to the RDA, if you go to the next slide, an interest group basically serves as a platform for communities to discuss topics of relevance to them, and perhaps also conduct some surveys, present some results at these RDA plenaries, and try to liaise and invite other groups that are working with topics of relevance to our interest. We might also end up creating a working group that more actively works towards converging on recommendations. And that could be a potential outcome of the discussions today. So if we go to the next slide, we have an overview of the agenda. So there's going to be a very short introduction here to just say hello and welcome. And then we're going through the room and the people on Zoom to see who's here and why. And then we're going to have a recap of the last plenary session where we had a wide series of different presentations on this topic, but they were longer than we had expected, and we didn't have any time for discussions. So that's what today's session is about. And we have reserved 50 minutes. We will start with a poll to kind of get an overall idea and perhaps also encourage the interactions warming up a bit. And then we're going to have a free room of discussions, and then ending with some summary thoughts and some ideas for the next plenary or some activities outside of the plenaries. Next, please. And my name is Volmar. I represent Elixir Europe, which is a life science data infrastructure for the European context, focusing on bioinformatics and life science data resources. And we also have a lot of other chairs for this group. So if we move to the next slide, we have representation across the United States, Africa, and Australia. And if you click to the next slide, we see that these are the individuals. We have Jeff online. I think Nicola will join us a little bit later, both virtual. And unfortunately, Susan and Alicia could not join today. Next slide. So the aims and objectives of the Life Science Data Infrastructures Group is to work as a bridge across the RDA interests groups and working groups, working on topics that would be interested to organizations like our own. If you go to the next. We have the previous session that I mentioned already introduced this topic a bit and had a few presentations of 6 different infrastructures showcasing their approach to enabling FAIR for researchers. And we also had a survey where we presented some of the results, and we're going to recap this for this session. So next, please. So this is the key aspects for FAIR for infrastructure. And if we go to the next slide, the purpose of this. I don't know why this happened. So the purpose of this session is to synthesize some recommendations based on the experiences that were presented. And if you want to go back to these at a later point, there's a link here that you can follow. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to hand over to Jeff to introduce the previous session.
Thank you, Volmar. Before we do that, we're just going to find out who's in the room. So welcome, everyone. I'm joining you today from Australia. It's 10 p.m., but that's the joy of a global world we live in. So we just have a couple of questions, and we have a poll. So you can either get out your phone and go to this QR code, or go to this URL, pollev.com/JC936. So I'll just leave that up for a few seconds, and then I'll unshare the screen and share another screen. we just have, I think, 2 questions to start with. So let me come out of that and I will go to this one. And this should now, again, the QR code's here, polev.com/JC936. This should come up for you. Heavy European presence, which isn't surprising, I think. Quite a few from Finland. And maybe, I guess, 1 or 2 from each of these other countries: Australia, USA, Germany, France, Sweden, Netherlands. Netherlands and Finland.
Jeff, can you see how many responses you've gotten?
Not off the top of my head.
We're 11 here in the room. Excluding myself. So
right. I think I can't see that easily, but that's a pretty good start. All right, so let's go to the next question. Thanks. And we're really interested, I guess, in how you identify. So what is your relationship to life science research data infrastructure? So are you a researcher, or do you support users of it, or staff its services, coordinate, lead, or direct its development, fund it? Or maybe you don't use life science research data infrastructure and you're just interested in the topic. So it looks like we are probably primarily looking at a group of folk who are building life science research data infrastructure, supporting users of it, staffing its services. And we have 1 researcher. So we have questions for both types of people. So we'll be really interested in the opinions of everyone in this room. So I'll just leave that up for maybe another few seconds. I think when I stop sharing, it may, I'm not sure if it'll still be live, but maybe someone, Volma, you can let me know that. All right, so I'm going to come out of that. Thank you, everyone. What I'm going to do now is come back into this, and I'm going to provide a bit more of a summary of that session at the last plenary that Volmar was talking about. Okay, so as Volmar mentioned, the interest group chairs, we had identified actually from the previous plenary that, you know, a topic, I guess, of fairness for biological or life science research infrastructures was of interest to all of us in the group. And so what we did prior to the last plenary was to actually go out and identify local infrastructures across our different parts of the world and survey them. And you can see the infrastructures here on the right. So they're pretty mixed. Some of them are focused around a very specific, I guess, biological topic. Some of them are more generalist resources and so topic agnostic. So we surveyed them, and we surveyed them on, you know, how did they self-identify or gauge how fair their resource was. So all the research, all the digital assets in their resource that they manage. So this matrix here is showing, I guess, around, it's structured around the research data lifecycle. So planning, collecting, generating data, processing, analyzing, preserving, sharing, reusing. We asked the managers of these resources to self-gauge on a level. Did they think they were mature in that space? Did they think they were, just starting off, or were they somewhere in between, or were things not applicable? So we have a pretty good mix here. I think it's interesting that, some of the resources that are quite early in their existence felt that they were very highly aligned and doing everything they needed to do to be a fair resource, but some of the others maybe not so much. Now, this is a very busy slide, but you can see here that we also asked them at the survey, what did those individuals think are features that would enable greater fair capability of their particular resource. So I'll quickly go over this. So for Findable, we had ideas like, well, if every repository has something like some kind of standard API that could automatically extract information across the resource, I guess this could be used for findability of data across a huge number of resources. And, to our knowledge, this doesn't exist. Also suggested was if every repository registered with some kind of data metrics tool, we would actually really be able to understand how each infrastructures were actually used and reused. Quite a lot of discussion about the requirement to have better metadata associated with everything, basically with tools on a service, with reference data, much more verbose capacity as well. When we asked about accessibility, there was a couple of ideas here about greater automation and integrating with developer resources would be useful, and also making sure that anything that had an identifier actually had a landing page. And if that landing page can actually show things like quite verbose metadata, that could be useful. When we're focusing on interoperability and reusable, definitely a theme that came out would be improving machine actionability of resources. I think that's something that most of our groups are focusing on and want to improve. Better functionality for deploying workflows, using APIs more, making them more, I guess, usable. And then just generally, I think, and this is sort of where we sort of want to go today, is that, it was sort of, fair is a word that's used all the time, but it's actually really, it's a more use if there's actually guidelines on how to apply the FAIR principles to a certain type of infrastructure. And so, a concept that came out of there was, what we might want to do is actually define what is a fair infrastructure concept and what are guidelines to be fair for infrastructures. Okay, we then also, at the session last time, we heard 6 speakers that are shown here on the right talk about the FAIR-related features of their infrastructure, and also their, ideas about what could be improved. And we also heard from the FAIR Sharing Working Group that we co-ran the session around the FAIR Cookbook, which is a tool to enable increased fairness. So the broad themes, I guess, from the presentations were that, there are actually many different infrastructures that support different stages of the research data lifecycle, which isn't surprising. So all of the ones we surveyed and all of the ones that presented, very few of those infrastructures are intended to support the whole life cycle. So they tend to focus on a few stages and not the whole life cycle. And in cases where one infrastructure may support multiple stages, they often don't necessarily have the same level of fairness maturity at those different stages. And there was a nice example presented by Lindsay Anderson from the Department of Energy. And what this is showing the research life cycle as a linear formation, and there's 4 separate resources that the DOE operate. And the purple is showing a high level of maturity, M is medium, and L is low. And so you can see that, whilst not all of these have that same level of maturity across all of them. which isn't surprising. It's also probably worth noting that, there are some stages of the research data life cycle that are probably overrepresented in our group, a good example of that is analysis platforms. So a lot of the infrastructures we were talking to were analysis platforms, or that was a major component. And you can see here again that, of these three resources coming out of the DOE, this is the analysis stage, and these are all highly mature in that component, or in that sector of the life cycle. And then another theme, or another concept that came out, was that it's not necessary to build all the functionality to make a resource fair within the resource, and infrastructures can actually leverage other specialized infrastructures to fulfill those roles. So we heard about how Galaxy Australia, which is an analysis platform, researchers can build workflows in there, but Galaxy doesn't really have the capacity to make those workflows particularly findable. So they publish their workflow descriptions in a workflow registry called Workflow Hub, and that means they're much more findable and citable and better described. The second, I guess, broad theme was that when we talk about data infrastructure in life sciences, we are talking across quite a wide range of types of infrastructure. So it could be data repositories. We could be talking about tool repositories, workflow repositories, workspaces, and more. So when we're thinking about all of these, an obvious feature that needs to be considered is that observing metadata standards. So, for instance, using community endorsed ontologies and controlled vocabularies and APIs is probably more than relevant. It's necessary for the focus topic. So, for instance, we heard from a number of human genomic data resources, and so there's a whole slew of standards that are relevant for that space. Something else I thought that was really useful to consider in this conversation was, if resources have to be able to identify how fair they are in order to understand where they sit, I guess, on a spectrum, and to be able to improve things. So there's actually quite a lot of tools out there which allow a quantitative or semi-quantitative assessment of the fairness of the digital assets associated with that infrastructure, and that allows the infrastructure to do some benchmarking, and, as I said, current assessment of their fairness and subsequent improvement. And we heard a really nice example from Sumia at HDA Bionet in Africa about some work that they were doing, where they are applying various fair metric levels. So for example, the Fair Data Maturity Model it's actually an output of a RDA interest group. And I think also the Fair Software tool. It's worth noting that there's quite a few of these Fair Software Evaluator tools. So all of these can be used. The infrastructure operator can decide, is that okay or not? What can we improve? So that's actually something to consider. And then the last theme I think that was coming out was that, user supplied metadata is often lacking. So there are probably things that infrastructures can do. I mean, apart from training and documentation, but proactively deploying user-friendly systems to encourage the really easy input of appropriate metadata is useful. So this is, when I say that, I mean things like, if it's possible to load controlled vocabularies by default. So, someone starts typing, or I don't know, whatever, it appears on a list. If people are, typing things in manually or doing them automatically, incorporating metadata validation tools is also really useful. And one of the speakers noted that actually can help educate users that something isn't quite right and can be improved. And something else, and this is, I guess, a high overhead, but some of the infrastructure managers and projects have actually gone and actively curated content that's already in the resource to increase the fairness. So, and again, we heard from RDA BioNet that they do that for some of their content. So again, this is using the fairness assessment tools and then modifying and improving the descriptions. Okay, so that's a very high-level overview, and now I'm going to pass back to Volmar, who will give a perspective from a European perspective.
Yes, and even more locally. So even more locally, actually, from my own context where I'm operating in Elixir Sweden and the projects I'm involved in. So how could I take the things that we were talking about and translate that into some challenges and things that we could do on the local part in the infrastructure that I'm part of. So if we go to the next slide. So we also had some discussions in the interest group following the plenary. And right from the start, I mean, so we have had some discussions about infrastructure often being a patchwork for the research projects. They have different infrastructures supporting them with different parts of the project. So you have data generation from perhaps one or two or several platforms, and then you might have the compute and storage being a second component, which has some live-serving specific support, like tooling and types of compute resources that would be available for that specific type of project. And you need some sort of let's call it streamlined and seamless kind of interoperability across these. So we started looking at different life cycle perspectives. I mean, beyond the ones that we had from the presentations already, just start considering, so where are the different types of infrastructures and what kind of handover points do we see here, and what could be useful then to start thinking about for these handover points to make sure that, I mean, it is as easy as possible for a researcher to both get and move around the data across these infrastructures, but then also get the associated metadata and the data files in a format that would be easy then to share with the wider research community when the analysis is done. So next slide, please. So in my context, I'm working for a life science infrastructure in Sweden, which has several platforms beyond bioinformatics, which is my home. So we are working with several different types of technologies, and then also on many different types of biomolecular materials. So just for context, next, please. And here you can progress 3 more. So this just shows a range of different information systems that you would probably be working with throughout a study, and following something like a generalized life cycle for these kinds of experiments. So you usually have the design phase where you choose and compose your infrastructure design, which types of experiments you're supposed to be conducting, and then you need to set up contracts and set up timelines for doing the sample collection, the preparatory work, and then handing it off to a sequencing facility or whatever technology you're using. When the data comes from that facility, you usually hand it over to some sort of compute and storage facility, and then you might need to install and set up some tooling on that facility that can run and give you the computational resources that you need to complete the project. The files that are coming out from those workflows are being saved somewhere. That could be a institutional repository in the meantime. And then at the end there with outputs, you also have these international research databases where things should be shared. And I mean, each of these boxes here could be several suppliers that either could be internal within the project or the institute, or they could be external suppliers. So you would often, at least from my experience, use several contractors or, I mean, suppliers within your institute that you need to negotiate with and give them some specifications on what you need. And they have knowledge that you don't have as a researcher. So they know more about the technologies and the parameters that they've set up for those different kinds of experiments. And you need that when you then are supposed to share it. So people can make a good assessment if the data would be useful for another study. Next, please. And here I'm going through the same, but adding some examples of what kind of data assets or digital assets and metadata that you might see in the different phases. So the first one, for study design, you would either discover existing protocols for the different types of experiments you're doing, or create some new protocols for the different things that you're doing. Identify standards that would be useful, and that could be file formats, and those could be designed or chosen depending on the tools that you need to use downstream. So it's kind of a configuration process to make sure that you have a data management plan or a project plan that contains the information you need to be able to get all the way over to the outputs and be able to share some of the critical components that are part of this. So, and those will depend, of course, on the study. So next, please. I mean, since this is a lot of information that's being collected, it would be useful to do that in a structured manner. And I'm not saying that everything should be an RO crate, which this is the illustration for a research object. But conceptually, you will incrementally collect more and more information. And when sharing this, you need to bundle it in some manner. So you could metaphorically think of it as a folder containing all of these pieces. So you could, when you look at the data, find the protocol that defines how it was collected. And ideally, this information should be as structured and easily available as possible. So you could index it in search systems, do filtering, and not having to kind of go through all of these manually to choose which data would be relevant for a future study. And this would also be helpful for the individual researcher in the project. The problem here, if you're gonna work with defining all the standards and things you need, is that there are so many of them. These numbers are from the Fair Sharing Registry. It's just an illustration that there are many standards that you might need to account for. But if you have a given type of study, that will give you some feedback on what kind of standards you should use to be compatible with the databases that are commonly used and the kinds of scenarios that you expect people to be interested in that data to go through. So if we click to the next slide. This is an illustration of one kind of project that I'm involved in. And this is a federated infrastructure where there's supposed to be a portal that kind of merges information from several different types of resources. So you could have different types of users using the data from different angles. So in this case, we have a physician, a researcher, and there could be others that are interested. And the data itself comes from the rare disease domain. And then you often are interested in some genomic components, some information about the disease, and then some information about the patients and cohorts and things like that. So and these might be distributed over different types of registries or databases. And then you need some way of consolidating and making sure that the data is structured in a way that it can be kind of federatedly searched. So you can merge the relevant resources where it matters to solve certain types of queries. I mean, a service like this could include a query builder, and then that query builder or this virtual portal might have this kind of specification of which standards you need to follow. And the slide you see now is for another federated infrastructure for genomics more generally. And here we have some components that are part of a starter kit for kind of allowing people to do data discovery, getting access to files, and for those managing those resources, controlling access. So making sure that the appropriate users and with the appropriate permissions get access to it. I think we could have discussions on what FAIR would mean depending on different kinds of use cases, and having some recommendations based on that. You could have the discussions also based on different components of these infrastructures, and you could have them also on the type of infrastructure, if you will. So if it's computational resources or whatnot. But I hope that the discussions today could kind of end up with something that could be of interest to us as a community to start converging on, and where the FAIR principles kind of fall short in their as they are defined in the original paper. So the punchline there, I think, is the final principle with reuse, and the final subtopic there, which is use domain-specific standards. And that puts all of the other principles in context. So I think that could also be an interesting thing to consider. Like, should we have different profiles for our infrastructures that define the kinds of standards we use? Are there any common standards that would be interesting regardless of which domain you're using? And how could you solve these situations where you have different types of resources that might need to be consolidated for different federated data integration scenarios? So that's something that I think would be interesting to continue with. And with that, I think we could go to the next part of the talk, and Jeff is going to take over.
Thanks, Velmar. So we are going to now have a discussion. So we would love everyone to participate. We're going to, I guess, structure this with another poll. There's another link to the notes. Feel free to write anything in the shared document. So I'll just leave that up if you want to go into that document. And please, if you can also add your name, that would be fantastic. So, I guess we're interested in, any of the things here about, how do we think about making the data movement from one infrastructure to the next around a data lifecycle seamless across infrastructures? What do infrastructures need to think about to enable this? And do you know, what do you already know about that's already out there that's of relevance? Okay, so if you keep the notes document open, feel free to write anything in there. We are going to go back to a poll, just really to get the conversation going, and get some ideas up on the screen to get our juices going. So again, same place you were before. So I will come out of that and I will come back into this, and I will just start to present again. So we're starting off with 3 questions for the researchers in the room. I think there was only one researcher in the room, but I'm sure a lot of us have been researchers in the past. So I guess what we're interested in here is just, if people are doing research, and again, it might be someone who's a researcher, how many infrastructures are they using in a typical research data lifecycle? So we've got one for 4 to 5 different infrastructures, or 2 to 3. So that's a lot of handover points between both of those. So a couple more in 2 to 3. So I guess we're talking maybe, well, anyway, we'll get more into the details later. So 2 to 3 or 4 to 5. So it's certainly not 1 in this sample, but it's certainly not, 1 for every single stage. All right, well, let's move on to the next question. And this one is, if you are a researcher and you're moving from one of those infrastructures to the next, what are your challenges you face with those digital data assets? So we'll just leave this up for a little bit. it's free text, and I think when they come up, people can vote them up or vote them down. So we'll see what is coming out. Don't be shy. How's it going there, Bulma? I can't see anything actually. Oh, here we go. Based on support experience.
Yeah, that was
Okay,
me
so
adding
this
it,
is
actually.
okay. So recovering information about the experimental configuration. Bandwidth, is that literally bandwidth of the network, or is that bandwidth of the researcher in understanding how to get data assets out of one and into the next? Material transfer, that's interesting, between infrastructures and policy. It's not something we've heard before. Unfamiliar interfaces. All right, we might, a bit of upvoting for the policy and material transfer issues between infrastructures. So we're going to take note of these, and we may come back and we've got a few more questions, but I'm just going to write some of these down. All right, well, let's move on to the next question. Thank you. And this one is, again, I think focused on a researcher. So they were the challenges. What features would be useful? What would you like to see in those data infrastructures to help address those challenges? Do you have any ideas? You know, what have you said, oh, I really wish this thing would do this. What would that be? I can't see the room. Oh, there we go. All right. Interoperable or compatible policies related to the policy one. Based on experience, so I guess this is someone who basically the infrastructure should do more, I guess, automatically, make life easy for the researcher. I think that means, and I think that's somewhat related to the next, just do the fairness for me. Standard procedures, APIs. Okay, all right, well, I'll leave that up just for another few seconds, and then we're going to change tack a little bit and ask questions towards the infrastructure managers and developers and providers in the room. So let's move on to that. So do you run an infrastructure? And if you do, what parts of the research data life cycle does your particular infrastructure cater for? Noting that it may be multiple areas. Of a mix. Mostly processing, analysis, preservation, and sharing. Oh. All right, I don't see any changes now, so that may be a good. I think we're probably done on this one. And the next question is, we're going to ask it differently. So this is very hard to gauge, I guess, what's going on at each infrastructure. So the next question is, I guess, another way of asking it. And so based on that previous answer you've just given, how many parts of the research infrastructure did you denote? So how many parts of the infrastructure does the particular infrastructure you're talking about cater for? Does it just cater for analysis, or does it cater for processing, analysis, and sharing? All right, I think we've got quite a few. That's 8 responses, I think. I'm not sure how many people are in the room, Volmar? I can't actually see approximately.
Yes, maybe I should update the count. I see that there might be some new people. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 now.
Okay. All right, well, we'll probably move on. So we're going to delve into this a little bit more. So the next question was, well, no one just had one area there. And I guess, or no one infrastructure there catered for all of the areas. So I guess we were just now interested in, well, what features do you provide or support to enable data or digital asset exchange with other infrastructures elsewhere in the cycle? And when we say digital asset, we mean we're also including things like workflows. So not just the data that goes in or out of the analysis, but the analysis as well. APIs, data management plans, transfer, service, hands-on support, the processing facilities as well, harmonized metadata. that. Okay, I'm going to move to the next one now. And I guess that was a good start, but what we want to start doing now is really drill into the F, A, I, and R. So some of those are quite broad. So which features of those actually enable findability, and what in your infrastructure do you use to enable findability of the digital assets produced? And you can be quite specific here. That will be useful for us to understand. Persistent identifiers, APIs, hands-on support, difficult to scale, metadata that adheres to community standards, integration with indexing services, that's nice. Harmonized metadata. Integration of the search API. All right. Now we're going to go on to the A. So interested in which features enable accessibility of those assets produced by your infrastructure. I'm not sure I know what a data transfer service is, so that may be something to discuss later. Does anyone who wrote that want to elaborate?
I can elaborate on that one as well, if no one else wants to. I would prefer to leave the mic to someone, maybe the person who voted +1. Okay, I see no hands. So what I meant in my infrastructure, we do have a, let's call it a custom protocol for delivering files between the computational storage and other kinds of compute-related infrastructure and the data producing facilities. So that can kind of give you the files to the correct project allocation and where you actually have the storage allocated for that specific project.
Cool, great. Out of interest, while there's other questions in, does that, and how does that work, or does it scale beyond your infrastructure to other infrastructures too? Like, what's the general applicability of what's been developed there?
So, I mean, I think that tool is open source. It could be used for others as well. You need to set up a service and then you have a client that you can use. And I think it's based on some standard protocols. But at the same time, it's a federated infrastructure within Sweden as well. So that means that it's still solving the problem of transfers across different infrastructures.
Yep. Thanks, Forma. All right, so we've got APIs for machine accessibility, a clear license for the content, authentication and authorization infrastructure, the data transfer service. multiple user interfaces and functionality for humans, persistent identifiers, policies, access policy and approval, and metadata encoded standard knowledge representation system. All right, we're getting there. Now we're interested in interoperability. Which features enable interoperability in your particular resource? So standards coming out here, community-based standards, enforcing those community-based standards. I like that. Ontologies. I saw further down here, adoption of standard file formats as well. Cross-references with other resources. Yep, standard vocabulary is coming up again. All right, I'm mindful of the time. I'm going to move on to the next one, which will be reusability, and then we'll get into the discussion section. So which features enable reusability of the digital assets produced by your resource? Data quality reports. License. Yep. Those standards again. Yep. High quality metadata that is aligned with community-based standards. Data managers ensuring the quality of the data. Yeah. That curation component over the top. Does anyone, I wonder if anyone here is more around sort of in the workflow space or something. I wonder if anyone works on that and has some comments there. All right. Sure there's any more coming in. might move on to the next question. And this next one really is, I guess, the start of a conversation. So this is, I guess, moving towards what might we do together? And really this, I think the way to ask the question is that, what would you really like? What would you most like advice on? What would you like to understand more, or to gain, I guess, strategies for, in order to better provide support for digital asset exchange with other infrastructures elsewhere in the life cycle. So I'm going to just leave this up on the screen, I think. Now, I think Volmar, are you going to, because you're in the
I'm here.
room, yeah,
Yes.
is it possible to sort of, because I can't see what's going on in the room very well, if we leave this up, and really what we would love to do now is just have a conversation. And this is, so all of those questions were really to get us thinking, I guess, thinking about what concerns us most. And so, yeah, I think we'll leave that up, and I will hand over to you, Volmar.
Yes, that sounds good. So I'm not sure how many people are online at the moment. I had to close down my computer screen, so I don't see the Zoom at the moment. We have a few people there, but I think we're in the majority in the physical room. So I mean, I think
We have
it's
3
good.
online, so
Yeah.
not many.
And we can still kind of add ideas to this poll, but I would just like to invite anyone who would like to express some ideas on what you would like to start collaborating on, or what we should try to focus on together, as maybe the first thing that pops up in your head. Anyone willing to say the first word? I see 2 hands. I'm gonna take the closest one first.
Yeah, I guess more a question of clarification. Elixir, by the way, for those who don't know, Fabi from Elixir Europe, around so infrastructures, because I guess even in some of the responses, we've kind of got you're talking about data management and then talking about AI, and you showed at the start, so there's quite a spectrum. Is there in the interest group a feeling for which areas yourselves actually, in terms of what you were thinking initially, or because I guess this is such a big space to tackle? So sort of, I guess, a question for the interest group and everyone in the room, if there's a particular couple of areas to focus on, I guess.
So we haven't really coordinated in the interest group yet what we would like to focus on together. So I'm going to respond for myself and some work that I'm also involved in Elixir. I mean, use cases I think is important, and giving examples of kind of how you can go from data that is maybe not perfectly fair to something that is fair, and having these journeys documented in some helpful way for others to learn from them. So, I mean, being able to have a entry point to examples of good, fair implementation, so to speak, and where these handover points have been solved in a productive way. So just having a shared place where we could look at those examples, I think would be very useful as a starting point.
Yeah, I would probably add also that I guess each of us, when all of us are affiliated with different infrastructure organizations, and I guess we're heavily influenced by what is happening locally. So, for instance, my group, or in Australia, we the work that we're doing isn't mostly focused around data assets. It's more around, as I said, analysis. So the workflows and things like that. But so I think depending on different co-chairs of the group, we have a different view. But ultimately, the aim of this interest group is to cater for all life science data infrastructures, and I know that's quite broad, but I think if we can work towards principles that could be applied no matter really what stage of the infrastructure the research data life cycle we're at, that could be something that could be useful. So I think specific is good, but generalist in a way with examples of specificity, I think is probably better.
Yes, my name is Sveinung Gundersen. I'm from Elixir Norway, and I'm going to use sort of a bit my experience from Elixir Norway, and I don't know if it's transferable to others, but I have a hunch it might be. And the way I see it, one of the challenges that we're having in Norway is the sort of top level support for the amount of work that actually is to get the infrastructures running and have the technology there, and especially in a domain-centric way, because there are some, of course, there's from the research councils, there are requirements for fair data and all of that, and then there's work on general aspects. But I mean, in many cases, what's needed in the life science domain is much more domain-centric than what is provided there, and the sort of some work on higher levels to actually get people to understand how much effort it is to make something that is really useful.
Yeah, I also think that it's important to be able to make good arguments and showcase how kind of we as infrastructures fit into kind of the fair perspective in general. And I mean, also something else that I've been discussing, and I just added here, is that, I mean, making the different kinds of research infrastructure visible is also perhaps something that could be useful. I mean, how do we describe the different types of infrastructures that are commonplace in the life sciences and some types of projects? So you could compare and learn from something that's more closely aligned with the activities that you are doing. So, I mean, if you're working with federated stuff for disease and clinicians, then that might be slightly different from if you're focused on the computational and workflow side with the life sciences perspective. I see a hand.
I'll go. Mark Musin from Stanford. I think our community, in many sense, reminds me of what it must have been like to be part of the CAD-CAM community before the CAD systems and the CAM systems actually talk to one another. And it is outside the realm of either of those groups, but took a lot of work on the part of standards organizations to actually figure out how computer-assisted design and computer-assisted manufacturing could actually work together. And I think we're in the same boat. We have laboratory notebook systems that don't talk to repositories. We have LIMS systems that don't talk to our notebook systems. And I think we talk about the fragmentation in biological infrastructure. And a lot of that is because there's no incentive right now for manufacturers to develop the standards that would allow their various components to speak to one another. And we're never going to have the complete accessibility of data across the whole life cycle until we can start doing that. And I don't think it's really within the expertise of any of us in this room to create those kinds of standards and create those interfaces. But we can at least acknowledge the fact that without those standards and interfaces, I think our ability to have integrated fair data is going to be really stymied.
So do I interpret you correctly if I say that you're looking for, I mean, identifying the connections that should be there and some of the requirements that we would like someone to fill the gap for or help define, so to speak?
Exactly. And at least in the case of CAD-CAM, which is the best analogy I can think of, the manufacturers themselves did not see any interest in doing that. It really came because the government said, this is nuts, and you guys have to have your particular pieces talk to one another. And so government got involved in creating the necessary standards. I don't know if we're going to see that either in Elixir or anything I can imagine in the US, But I think it's going to take someone in a position of authority who's actually paying the bill for all of this to say, look, unless there is some cooperation and unless there's interchange of information, we're not going to get to the place we want to be.
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond to that as well?
I guess I have a reflection, and it's that I was interested in, the mentioning of manufacturers there. And I guess, I think in the interest group so far, where we often think about, open source solutions that are built sort of locally and haven't really factored in that really critical, aspect of systems that are built by manufacturers and are sold as well. And I think that's a really good point. If those, I think maybe the open source solutions are aware of community standards and things like that, but the potentially the sort of commercial manufacturer ones are not. So I don't know if that's true. If anyone wants to comment on that, I'd be interested, but I think that's a really interesting point that we haven't considered.
I see a hand.
Yeah, to build on that and the previous speaker here, my name is Lars. I work in Sweden for the National Bioinformatics support structure, and I work with the sort of direct infrastructure part of that, providing services to HPC and other things. And what I have noticed, and I think where we can start to push this, is we as a community need to provide help to the purchase departments to do requirements that fulfill the needs that we have. Because one of the most powerful tools we have is our money when we want to buy things. So when you do a purchase of a system, especially if you do it in pharmaceutical, I have a background in pharmaceutical industry, the amount of pressure you can put on a manufacturer is quite high by just saying, we require your system to deliver this to us, this format, this type, this style. And this can give rise to, this type of pressure can give rise to the CAD/CAM development that we heard about earlier. That you get a standardization and you get the same as the V3C that was sort of came together by industry because they needed to fulfill standards that were coming as a demands from the purchasers. So I think us as a community could probably do a lot for helping the different purchase departments to actually generate harder requirements on these parts.
Anyone want to comment? Otherwise, I have a reflection. So then I will start with a short reflection, and maybe someone else want to fill in. I think that, specifying the requirements, it might be difficult. And I'm not sure if some of the problem could be that the market is small or too fragmented. So it's difficult to find a solution that's easy to sell, or the buyers in this context doesn't pay enough or is not specific enough that it would be interesting, or where we just don't want commercial solutions. So there's I think a problem also with kind of a market fit here, and could we create a better situation for people, or identify some scenarios that are common enough to kind of become a market for these commercial suppliers? And then do we really want that? Or rather, in which context do we see that there would be real buyers?
Yeah, hi, Sven Gundersen in there. I think you can also take the same analogy and move it into the sphere of research funding, and say that, I mean, there are requirements for data management plans now, right? And then projects need to have some funding available for actually doing that. And if there are more requirements on the top level on the actual implementation of interoperability and the adoption of standards and the things that are sort of around that, not just sort of minimal data management plan, which is a big thing in itself, of course, but still there's lots of other things that should be improved, and that can come as requirement on from the top level or university level or somewhere.
Thank you. So that is at least something we want, and then the aspect of what we can get is something for a later discussion, I guess. So is there anything else we would like? Is there something maybe we could highlight from the list there, Jeff?
I think something we've talked about before is the concept of an audit trail for data that goes through. And I guess we're interested, you know, if people do that currently, I'd be really interested in how that actually happens. I think that's a couple of people have mentioned it. So I guess people put this in because they would like advice on that. Do we have anyone in the room who can provide advice on that?
So maybe to see if I interpreted the idea there correctly. Is it provenance, kind of this incremental collection of different parts of the metadata and how the data has been processed from one infrastructure over to another and then perhaps to the third?
I guess so, but we'd need to ask the people who put the notes in there.
Lars Eklund again. Yeah. So this I put in the audit trails for data. Again, basically, that's exactly as you interpreted it. That I'm talking about generating a auditable trail from generation throughout to repository, where you each time data is accessed or moved in some way or processed in some way, it gets another beat of in the audit trail and then another entry. So exactly sort of as was on the kit on the tin, generating audit trails so that we can know where data has been, what has happened to it, and from the start of generation until the end. And at the moment, I don't know if there's particularly good systems for this. I mean, we've just heard that there's large discrepancies even in LIMS and notebooks and so on and so forth. So this is something we need to look into, how you can specify this in a technology agnostic way, I guess.
Thank you. And I see a hand.
Yeah, so just following up on that point. So before I was at Elixir, I was at the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. And then one of the places where I was based, I took it sort of personal to try and figure out the audit trail, almost by trying to meet the policy people, the data access committee, the infrastructure people. And what I was shocked was that most of the answer was email the PI. Okay. Oh, can we grant access to data? Email the PI. Oh, can we upload the data? Email the PI. And I think in a way that Mark's point about, yeah, there, you know, lab notebooks don't talk to the LIMS don't talk. And I think that the idea of requiring that from the providers and the software providers, I think there's a connection even within an institute that's missing. So I think in terms of the data infrastructure, if you think about it as, yeah, the governance, the legal team, the policy, the DAC, and so on, all the way through to then, you know, the people running the code, running the servers, that actually there's, even within an institute, they should try and connect. And then whenever they're asking for a LIMS system, they say, well, okay, well, I'll only buy your LIMS system if it connects with my, you know, data access provider tool, if it connects with my AI, if it provides an audit trail. So I think there is an opportunity for infrastructures to realize that they need to connect their internal points first, so then they can leverage this. And I think that's, yeah, just a general point, I guess, that I've witnessed is missing. Yeah.
Thank you. I see a hand. Fantastic.
Hi, my name is Pui Keifeng from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. I'm just wondering, I'm a ICT architect, so I'm not really into the life sciences. So from my point of view, suppose that each and every thing that we've talked about, the LIMS, the lab notebooks, the repositories, all have an API, and they kind of know how to talk to each other. Would that resolve this? I mean, is it really just a matter of having that technical component implemented, or are there other things that I'm overseeing? And also, I see two at the chat.
So the comment about the two in the chat, Jeff might have already looked at that. A comment on the API thing. I mean, it would be useful to have a common way to communicate, but then you also need to make sure that you're communicating using the same language, that would require a lot of work on, I mean, specifications, describing what should actually be inside of this communication, what needs to be transferred from one place to another, and how should it be encoded. I mean, what should you write in that description for the other side to actually understand it and be able to make use of it? So, I mean, I think the solution would be if you had APIs, but then you also need probably a large process to form groups of people that could kind of define these requirements and really find wide agreement on what should be in those communications.
And then a follow-up question upon that, is that actually achievable? The common vocabulary. I mean, I can imagine that up to a certain point you can get to a common vocabulary, but at a certain point it will also divert. But is that level of common vocabulary enough to establish this or to address this problem of exchange?
A good question. I mean, I have my ideas. Is there anyone else who would like to say something? Yes.
I think you're right. There will be a certain level of common vocabulary, and I think it's not going to be perfect, but I think it will get quite far. So if we can establish that, I think the challenge, not to repeat myself, but at the minute there's no vocabulary between the systems, right? So in that kind of sense, I think if we can get some words exchanged between different parts, even within one institute and then two institutes, and then we can have these meetings where the 4 or 5 groups stand at the front, they talk about how their two systems connect, and then we can start to look at the overlap. At the minute, I get the impression there's just no communication at all. So I think that would be a massive leap if we can start talking about our individual vocabularies and then identify common. I just don't know if that initial communication has happened.
Volmar, I was interested in your slides at the beginning where you were mentioning things like RO crates, and I wonder if there's capacity for, if there is an API that works from one to the next, but an RO crate is effectively exported from one to the next, that type of approach would probably be quite powerful. I don't know of any instances of that being used in that way, but again, that's something, I'd be interested in people's views on that in the room.
Very good point. And I mean, the purpose of my illustration was a little bit to tie into this. I mean, it's a pretty generic idea of having a little file that just describes, so what's this data thing over here and what's that data thing over there and how do they relate to each other. And it doesn't really contain all the specifications. It points to other places where those specifications are. So, I mean, you still have the smorgasbords of all the standards. So the good thing is that there are so many of them. But when you need to communicate with others, you need to decide. So you choose the same standards or find ways of translating between two different standards so that the communications are successful. And I mean, my personal thought is that these federated scenarios could be a starting point. I mean, we have some that are kind of cross-European. We have some that are more local, like in Sweden. And there are some that kind of try to do this on a global level. And you see it between some of these genomics resources repositories where there's exchange across the entire world, but they might not support all the kinds of queries that you would like to do. And then maybe there needs to be some work either with the repositories to help add more information or link to additional standards, or at the infrastructures to create a layer that kind of supplements what's already out there.
Volmar, just a time check. We've got about a minute left, and then we'll have to start on the wrapping up.
Just to pull on the point of the repositories, there's been a couple of sessions during RDA talking about repositories, domain specific and generalist and so on. And I think one of the things would be to kind of start to view some of the repositories in a way as being a bit like the service providers in terms of demanding. So I think some infrastructures, institutes and groups can start to put in requests as such, so if there's a demand for a repository to provide certain metadata fields and so on. So I know for like ENA now you have to have a minimum geographical metadata is now a requirement because there's a demand from groups. So I think also infrastructures can leverage their existence and their need as users onto repositories as well. So it can work both ways. So.
Thank you. I mean, I'm not sure if we had a specific segment for or a question for collecting ideas on like if there's interested on going forward with an interest group or a working group in this Slido or poll thing. Yeah, so maybe we can leave this one up for a while, or just leave it open in general. So then we could go back to it when it's time matures, and I think we need to have some sort of indication of if you would be interested in working on FAIR for infrastructure, and then the next step would be to maybe have a meeting where we bring some ideas and a pitch of what we would be interested in more specifically doing together. Because I mean, we have discussed many different kinds of opportunities of things that some of us are interested in and some challenges, but we need to bite off something that would be large enough and that would provide value to us as individuals in the infrastructures where we're located. And I mean, I think please do add your name to the collaborative notes, and then we could reach out to you after the session or become a member of this RDA group. And you can do that for free you need to register an account on the RDA website, but then if you just click the interest groups web link, then you can click to also join the interest group, and you will receive emails. It's very sparse with the communication, so it's not going to flood your inbox. And I think this also ties into starting to do some plans for the next plenary, and what we would like to have as kind of the topic for a series of presentations or some other activity that we do together at the virtual plenary. I think it was in May, but I don't remember the dates now. So please do go into the notes and add your name. I'm not sure if you could pull up the slides as well to get to the shared notes thing.
All right, let me, the slides, this.
Yes, exactly. So if you haven't already added yourself to the shared notes, please do so, because then we have your email address, and then you could also add to the notes if there's anything specific that you would like to highlight for the other people who attended, or that you think that we should consider for the future discussions in the interest group with the partners we have. So I think we are pretty close to time. Jeff, do you have anything else you would like to add?
No, I think I'd just like to thank everyone for coming along today. I think for us, we're still the interest group, we're still collecting our thoughts. So this has been really useful for us to hear some different perspectives on this. There was actually a oh, it's too far. But will any ideas for future plenaries, please put them into the shared notes here. If you want to, we do meet about once a month. It was on that previous slide. It's around 10 p.m. in Europe. It's about 6 a.m. here in Australia, and it's the middle of the day in North America. Not the best times, but if you're interested in joining those groups, in those meetings, please let us know too, and put something in the notes document, and we'll make sure you're invited to those. But yeah, I'd just love to thank everyone for their time. I'd like to thank Volmar for being there in the room. Shame I can't be there.
Right, thanks a lot. And I mean, the format of the sessions is also something that we will discuss and kind of refine as we go forward. The last plenary, we ended up only having presentations, and this one, we ended up having only discussion. So I think that we need to strike a good balance there and try to make sure that we kind of have representation from a variety of different types of infrastructure. So we do solve some real problems, so to speak. All right, thanks a lot.